break officially, what I'd like to do is to ask each of you if you would share some folks to follow on Twitter based on who does good, interesting journalistic work. So if you want to give some shout-outs, this is a good opportunity.
Off-seat.
You can see the rest of this at cspan.org. Sure. As meetings to reopen the government and raise the nation's borrowing limit continue, the House is coming in to finish debate on another of those agency-specific spending bills. This one would temporarily fund American Indian programs.
Indian Health Service for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, has 10 1/2 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, has 9 1/2 minutes remaining. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, a valued member of our subcommittee and an advocate for Indian issues, gentleman Mr. Calvert.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Everyone in this body wants to end this government shutdown. We're all aware of the significant impacts the shutdown is having around the country. And I'm pleased that today that both sides have finally come to the table, and hopefully we'll reach a compromise agreement here in the next day or so. But today, we're here to consider a solution that aims to ease the urgent and substantial impacts to Indian country. House Joint Resolution 80, the American Indian Alaska Native Health, Education, and Safety Act, provides immediate funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, and Indian Health Services. As a member of the House Appropriations, Interior, and Environment Subcommittee, I'm well aware that the Indian country was already experiencing significant challenges before the shutdown as it adjusted to reduced spending levels. Now, with the federal government shutdown, Native American tribes across the nation are facing even more uncertainty. These tribes are now being confronted with different decisions about which services they can continue to provide without government resources. Just a few examples: tribal programs for health care for the elderly and disabled, bus service for rural areas, and infrastructure projects that were suspended indefinitely. I believe we must take action, reopen these critical government operations throughout Indian country. I'm thankful that my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, House Republican leadership, share my belief. Specifically, I want to thank my good friend from Idaho, Mike Simpson, for bringing this bill to the floor, and his terrific leadership as chairman of the House Appropriations, Interior, and Environment Subcommittee. I urge all my colleagues to support this important bill on behalf of all Americans in Indian country. Let's pass this bill and reach an agreement to get our entire government back to work for the American people. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 3 minutes at this time to the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, Peter DeFazio from Oregon.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. You know, this irresponsible, unnecessary, politically motivated government shutdown is unacceptable for all Americans, but it's particularly offensive to those in Indian country. The government's trust obligation to the tribes is not a discretionary act. It's a fiduciary responsibility. To assume that money associated with that fiduciary responsibility can be bartered or used as a political football is more than insulting. It's another example here of tabloid legislating, ripping issues from the headlines and trying to legislate based on negative public reaction to just some part of the Republican government shutdown. It's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, where an issue pops up, the far right pretends to care, suddenly, gee, we didn't know this would happen if we shut down the government, and they draft a continuing resolution to cover it, or their posteriors. Now, where was all of this concern for the tribes when sequestration kicked in? Where's the compassion for the poverty faced by our first Americans every day, not just when it's politically expedient? Where has the compassion been to address the high rates of unemployment, educational challenges, access to resources tribal people face every day? Challenges that have only been made worse by the Republican sequester. This is so cynical. Not only does the temporary measure for tribes inadequately fund few programs it identifies, that picks and chooses, it neglects other critical programs inside and outside the Department of Interior. What about the Office of Special Trustee? We haven't done so well as trustees of the monies of the Indian nations recently. We need the Office of Special Trustee. Oh, closed. What about the Bureau of Reclamation Office for dispersing settlements for Indian water rights? Closed. How about the Native American Low-Income Home Energy Assistance? Closed. Tribal nutrition programs? Closed. Even if this bill passed and became law, those would all still be closed. I guess, their compassion only goes so far. There are many other things missing from this bill. I could go on and on. Already, sequestration has disproportionately impacted Indian country. We don't need to rub salt in the wound with this continuing resolution that provides only 1/3 of the funding for these nations. The irresponsible tactics need to cease. We need to open up our government to the first Americans and all Americans. It's simple. We offered unanimous consent requests last Saturday when the Republicans adjourned in a huff and went off for a couple of days while the government was shut down. Any one of those acceded to could have brought a vote on a 6-week continuation of government at the Republican levels of funding with sequestration. That's a concession on the part of Democrats. It's your budget, those lower numbers, the Ryan budget. You could have done that. You wouldn't do it. You changed the rules of the House so we couldn't bring it up as a privileged resolution, and then you pretend to care. Come on, guys. You can do better than that.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
He reserved. Ask him if he has any more speakers.
Does the gentleman have any more speakers? Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself such time as I may require.
The gentleman is recognized.
So here we are, Mr. Speaker. We're 14 days into the government shutdown. A shutdown that has cost this country money, has created enormous anxiety on the part of the federal workforce, the contract workforce, the entire country. In fact, there was a meeting of all of the leaders of the world over in Asia. And we weren't there because of the government shutdown. The Chinese, of course, took advantage of it. Both the President and the Prime Minister were over at this meeting of world leaders trying to suggest to them that it's time that the world became de-Americanized. I think that was their term. Because we can't get our act together. We can't even fund our own government. We can't even decide whether or not we're going to pay off our debts on time. And all of this, apparently, we're told, Mr. Speaker, was an idea that came from the Ted Cruz Tea Party wing of the Republican majority to shut down the government until they could have their way on what they called Obamacare, even though President Obama ran on the Affordable Care Act, which is its proper name, was elected with 5 million votes, still they wanted to stop it, to gut its principal provisions. And so here we are 14 days into a government shutdown, which is really an embarrassment to the entire institution, but it certainly ought to be to the House majority. And it's ironic with this particular bill because there are 579,000 uninsured American Indians and Alaskan Natives. And they would get coverage under the Affordable Care Act. 9 out of 10 of them are likely to qualify for financial assistance either through tax credits or by purchasing coverage in the marketplace. We'd get cost-sharing reductions, eliminate their out-of-pocket costs, or through an expansion of Medicaid if their state chooses to do that. So the vast majority of them, undoubtedly hundreds of thousands, would be better off if we were not only to not have shut down the government, but certainly by our having available to them the Affordable Care Act. So how ironic that here we are with a mini bill suggesting that we will fund a small share of the Interior Department to take care of American Indians and Alaska Natives. Well, obviously, we should be taking care of Native Americans. It should be our highest priority, and I know it has been for the chairman of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee, my good friend from Idaho, and our colleagues on that subcommittee, Mr. Calvert, Mr. Cole, a number of them. We've all agreed it ought to be a priority. But we also have a bill that needs to get passed. We have other agencies that need to be funded. If we were to continue in this manner, we would get the Interior Department funded by Halloween. That's not the way to do business. In fact, this bill doesn't fund Native American education programs in the Department of Education, doesn't fund the law enforcement programs at the Department of Justice to carry out the Violence Against Women Act, which was a key component, thanks to Mr. Cole, the Violence Against Women Act that we passed, make sure that Native American women are protected. It doesn't fund Native American social service programs at the Department of Health and Human Services. They don't get the child care and temporary assistance for needy families that they would otherwise get. It doesn't fund Native American housing programs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Almost 100% of HUD employees are furloughed. Doesn't fund the Native American employment and training programs at the Department of Labor, the Native American environmental programs at the Environmental Protection Agency. It doesn't fund the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, which oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. It doesn't fund the Special Trustee for American Indians, which administers $3.7 million in tribal funds and others, more than $700 million in individual Indian accounts. Doesn't fund the Office of Navajo Hopi Relocation, which administers the relocation settlement activities that arouse from land disputes between the Navajo and Hopi tribes. Doesn't fund the Institute of American Indian Arts or the Native American water rights settlement activities. Doesn't do what we need to do, which is to fund the Interior and Appropriations Bill. So I have to ask the majority, since this bill only funds 3 agencies, which represent 0.7% of the domestic discretionary budget, what are we going to do with the other 99% of the domestic discretionary budget? What about our other federal obligations to Native Americans? What about their housing and their child care services and their legal protections? This bill doesn't take care of that. Still, these 50,000 Interior Department employees still furloughed, even if this bill was to be enacted, which we all know it won't until the government opens. No money for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for new offshore oil drilling permits. There's no money for the Bureau of Land Management that processes lease sales and permits and for onshore oil and gas and coal and other mineral permits. They run the wild horse and burro adoption programs. They award the timber sales. No money for any of that. No money for the Fish and Wildlife Service so they can manage visitors to our national refuges. No money for hunting or fishing permits. What about the Forest Service? Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say this was well intended, but I know that it's an attempted Band-Aid to hide the real problem, which is the government is shut down. We need to open it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
My inquiry is the gentleman from Virginia's time expired.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, 521 years ago, an explorer named Christopher Columbus sailed west from Europe in an attempt to find a new route to the East Indies. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas, and as the story goes, he named the local inhabitants Indians. I note the irony that today has been designated Columbus Day, and here we are debating a bill to reopen key parts of the government so that the United States can honor the treaty obligations our forefathers made to the American Indians, the first Americans. The bill before us today is a good thing because it gives us an opportunity to continue to highlight the poverty and other hardships that exist today in Indian country as a result of the long, complicated, and difficult history of relationships between the United States government and more than 500 other sovereign nations that were here long before we were. So while we recognize and honor Columbus for his impact on our own nation's history, let us also recognize and honor the first Americans for their proud history and the sacrifices they made and continue to make for this great nation. That's why I would encourage everybody to vote for this bill. Frankly, I hope this bill isn't necessary. I hope that we can find a resolution to the differences that exist between Republicans and Democrats and that we can reopen all the government, as Mr. Moran just stated, is necessary. I agree with him fully. We need to get the government open again, and we need to address the issue of the debt ceiling. It is heartening to know that leadership in the Senate and hopefully in the House and the White House is having some quality time together, that maybe we can come to a resolution before more dire things happen and that we can get this government open. But I don't know that that's going to happen. And in the absence of not knowing that that is going to happen, wouldn't it be wise to have at least some of these bills that fund some key elements of our government ready to go in the Senate so that we can open some areas that I think have bipartisan agreement that need to be funded and need to continue? I said in my opening statement Saturday that Indian issues have been bipartisan on our committee. They've been supported by both Republicans and Democrats, whether it was under Mr. Dick's leadership when he was chairman or Mr. Moran's leadership when he was chairman or under my leadership. It's been a bipartisan issue to try to meet our treaty obligations and the moral responsibilities we have to the first Americans, American Indians. I want people to know that regardless, I want people in Indian country to know that regardless of the vote on this resolution, whether people vote for it or against it, that bipartisanship will continue. We will continue to work together to try to make sure we address these critical needs in our nation and our treaty and moral obligations we have. With that, Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 371, the previous question is ordered. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution making continuing appropriations for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, and the Indian Health Service for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of House Joint Resolution 80 is postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the House will stand in recess subject to the call of the Chair.
The House will be back in at 6:30 Eastern for final votes on the bill members have been debating that funds American Indian programs through